Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about our latest virtual issue in church history, that is on Christianity, Native Americans, and global indigeneity. And we are joined today by our guest editors, Brandon Bayne and Zara Surratt. And in terms of what this issue is doing, is it's a collected selection of past ASCH articles with an introduction and commentary talking about the topic at hand. So with that, I'll pass things off to our guest editors to introduce themselves.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for this opportunity, as well as to Church History for the wider opportunity of editing this virtual issue and the ability to go back and look at so many great publications. My name is Brandon Bayne. I'm an associate professor in religious studies at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm also affiliate faculty in both American Indian and Indigenous studies, as well as Latin American studies. And that gives you a bit of a sense of my work, which focuses on areas now known as northern Mexico and the southwest of the US. But in the period I'm looking at it, are places that are contested by indigenous communities and colonial agents, particularly Catholic missionaries in northern New Spain. So that's my basic introduction, Zara.
Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this. Very excited. So my name is Zara Surratt. I am the advisee of Brandon Bayne, and I am also a PhD candidate in religious studies at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm also a Spencer/National Academy of Education Fellow for the 2023 to 2024 academic year. In my academic work, I do religion in the Americas. I focus on Native American religion and Christian mission. And my current project is a history of St. Francis Mission School on Rosebud Reservation among Sicangu Lakotas. And it is in a territory that during the time period I'm studying is essentially Lakota land that Protestants and Catholics are arguing over who gets to settle and be a part of.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for sharing a little bit about your work. So I'll just start off by asking what your goals were in curating this issue. What were the kinds of things that you were hoping to convey in looking through these past articles from church history and trying to put together this?
Sure, I'll start off since I was approached first. And when I was approached, I positioned myself and said, I'm non-Indigenous, and I wouldn't be comfortable being the only voice curating this conversation. And so asked for permission to include an Indigenous scholar. And thankfully, Church History was very amenable to that. The editor, Andrea Stirk, immediately said yes. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to ask Zara to join. And my own positionality is as a settler, as a non-Indigenous person who grew up in probably the state most caught up in those histories, or certainly one that is uniquely caught up in it in the state of Oklahoma, former Indian territory, and was raised with all sorts of mythologies that personally I've been trying to deconstruct for myself over the last several decades. And so I think part of my interest here was to look back on some of that genealogy, going back to the 1950s in terms of the way that we've talked about interactions between white settlers and Native folks.
Yeah, so as Brandon mentioned, his positionality. So I am a descendant of settlers and Indigenous peoples of the Americas, particularly German immigrants and Western Shoshone peoples. So my life and my family's life has been very defined and affected by these sort of like push and pulls in this history of colonialism and settlement and survivance. And that's something that I wanted to bring up as we went ahead and reflected upon the trajectory of these articles, this continued sort of push and pull between what's identity, who gets to speak, who counts, right? What stories get included and what are the sorts of contours of those stories, right? And how is that itself like a reflection of empire and people's pushing back and fighting back for the right to self-determination and self-identity.
And maybe I'll just add a note there, Zara, that what you just said at the end speak to what my wider goal was. I think together our wider goal was, which is to situate accounts of encounter between Christianity and indigenous communities within that more global framework of colonial and imperial encounter, and not have an inflexible definition of what it means to be native that is constrained to the nation state or is even hemispheric, but understands it as this wider push and pull that Zara was talking about between indigenous communities and imperial or colonial settlement.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And I think with that, I'd ask you to get a little more into some of the articles that you were pulling together into this. So what were some of the kind of trends that you were able to demonstrate in terms of like trends in the larger field, or in terms of larger fields, I should say, right? Because you're kind of speaking between many areas of study here. What are some of kind of those big picture, larger trajectories of the historiography that you see kind of popping up in and demonstrated in these articles?
Yeah, I think you're right, Chris, that we are situated in between a number of fields. The most basic being the history of Christianity, which is the specialty of the journal, and Native American and Indigenous Studies, or NACE. And those are fields with different trajectories and different sensibilities around methodology, as well as what counts as scholarship. So there's some tension there, and there has to be some work that we're trying to do, but I think has a longer path to bring those conversations together. In terms of other subfields that I think we're touching upon in this virtual issue, within the history of Christianity, certainly American religious history is one starting point, although part of the trajectory we're going to takes us beyond American religious history, as well as global Christianity. I think really towards the end in those final articles by Sylvester Johnson and Lee Sean are prompting us to connect to conversations in global Christianity. Zara, do you want to speak to other trends that you identified?
I mean, I think you really brought us towards that kind of like, widening of this sort of field. We go from, starting out with white denominational politics meets, Cherokee survivance in the first article. And then we end, I think, with Lanji's article in Asia, in China, more specifically, but another thing I think I just have to speak towards the articles, is that one thing that we don't see in these articles actually is each one of the articles is a really beautiful reflection of sort of that positive push towards bringing, Native voice and accountability in, however limited, we're not seeing any of those problematic articles that are maybe being responded to that do a really poor job, right? That only center missionary narrative and often have the conclusion of, Christian conversion is ultimately good for peoples, and the violence that happens alongside it maybe is tragic, maybe is the result of a few bad eggs, but is not essential to the conversion process, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about Graeber's article later, but Graeber really pushes back against that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think with that, I would ask, kind of digging in there more, what are some of the things that you found particularly surprising or eye-opening about the articles that you were looking at? Maybe a couple things that particularly jumped out for both of you.
Well, Brandon, I know that you shared, right, but you brought it up first, but you shared in kind of being struck by the McNally article in just how almost ahead of its time, maybe. I think you used the term prescient.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, this speaks to trying to bridge together two different fields. I would say in terms of NACE, it wasn't ahead of its time. He was very much right up to date with what was going on in the late 90s, early 2000s in Native American Indigenous studies, but he was trying to bring it into conversations that were not used to interacting with that at all. And so it was really a delight to go back and read that essay and see the way that he had already, around 2000, nearly a quarter century ago, not only synthesized where the field had been, but had demonstrated what it would look like to center Indigenous scholars and to bring in new methods like ethnohistory and center that as well. So I found that helpful because our job in some sense was to go back and survey some of that genealogy, and he had already done at least half of that work for us. But it was also a reminder that we're not the first to come along and say, hey, we still are not centering Native voices. He was saying that 23 years ago.
Yep, absolutely.
And Zara, you're beginning to talk about Jen Graber's article. I mean, maybe that's another place where I don't know that it was a surprise to you because I know it's been influenced. Both of us have taught that article in other contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're familiar, if you're familiar with Jen Graber's work, which if you're not, I highly suggest that you do familiarize yourself with her. You know, but yeah, I mean, her article. So I'm going to leave the more global articles to you, Brandon, because I know those were the ones you particularly focused on, what with your specialization. But yeah, for me, you know, Jen Graber, Emma Anderson, and I think it's Sonia Hazard. Those were the three that really stood out to me. I'll start for now with Jen Graber, and then we'll see when the other two come in. But the Jen Graber one, you know, I always the word that comes to mind when I read these sorts of articles that are very powerfully in the opposite direction of rah Christians, which I don't mean to insult with that. It's just I'm coming from a field where I continuously have to read these sorts of these scholarships that so often are just these redemptive stories that ultimately are talking about benevolent Christianity, right? And so I always find these articles in the opposite direction to be brave. Particularly, you know, Jen Graber is a woman, you know, and she's pushing back upon this kind of historiography that often tries to place violence as something that happens alongside. Maybe it's the conquistador alongside the missionary, as opposed to the missionary that's actually bringing that out. And instead, she sits down and she really ties violence into this larger paradigm where you have these white Christians who are understanding warfare and massacre upon Indigenous peoples as sort of being God's plan. And it's a little icky, and it's very mysterious, and they can't really fully understand it, but it's ultimately redemptive. And then what she also does with that is she doesn't just leave the story as, and here is this really gross white perception, right? This sort of white justification of Native peoples dying. Instead, she sits down and says, okay, and then how are these Dakotas people perceiving this? How are they working with it? And they have a completely different take on the violence, right? Which is that this is something bad that's happening, and that it signals a need for a spiritual renewal, for a change, where they end up using Christian forms that are very not in line with the sort of white Christian settlement around them. So yeah, that article just, it really stands out.
I would say I'll tag on one. I won't speak about it as long, but one that I had read when it first came out, but returning to it was really powerful, and I think would be surprising to folks who have not read it, is Karen Velez's account of the Jesuit missions of Paraguay, but not focused on the Guarani or other indigenous people as per se, and not focus on the missionaries per se, but focus on tigers and jaguars and the role of animals and how they're a third kind of presence or party that have both sides seeking to explain violence, Zara, but the violence of animals, right? And decisions that are being made, whether to be in the mission or not, being based upon the action of these other sorts of agents.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and to kind of jump in there then too, this kind of looking towards subjects that are unexpected, you know, that's where Emma Anderson really strikes me. You know, Emma Anderson does not position herself as a scholar of childhood or child studies at all, but as far as I'm aware. But in her article on Rose Prince, you know, she's bringing attention towards Indigenous childhood. And that's also, while perhaps not quite as unexpected as a jaguar, in other ways, when you look at histories of Indigenous children, there's not a lot of them. And some of the ones that are actually histories of Indigenous children aren't even recognized as such. So Kateri Tekakwitha, for example, who is mentioned, a history of hers is mentioned in here, you know, people don't really think, oh, we're studying like an Indigenous adolescent, right? And bring that attention just towards subjects that maybe are unexpected, which goes to a larger point that we can maybe talk about later, which is like, who counts as a subject worth studying within the, you know, the study of church history or the study of Native Christianity.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing kind of what was particularly surprising about this. Along with that, I want to follow up by asking kind of how your own work and your own perspective on this scholarship shapes the way you kind of what drew you to these articles, but also how you're presenting them like in the introduction. Because it sounds like part of maybe what's particularly surprising or striking has to do with some of your own perspective as well.
Zara, why don't you continue? I think you're starting to get to that already.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, obviously, my study is on a boarding school, St. Francis Mission School in Rosebud Reservation, South Dakota, very close to Pine Ridge. The people there, you know, the students, I'm studying the early generations, right? First, second, third boarding school students. So we're talking like 1890s to 1920s, down to the furthest point. And that can make it really difficult to be able to archives already. Like when you talk about Catholic archives, you know, there's a huge amount of erasure, and there's also a privileging of specific voices over other voices. The archives also are designed to tell a specific story. So for me, the reason that the jaguars and the children really stand out for me is because these are precisely the sorts of things that I'm looking towards in order to try to get the story of youth's experiences within a territory that is enduring colonization, settlement, federal Indian policy that's calling for compulsive education geared towards assimilation, envisioning a time where the reservations are going to no longer be, and essentially students are going to be shipped to cities where they're going to be educated, and then they're going to go ahead and they're just going to join the urban or suburban underclass, right? So that's kind of the things that we're dealing with. And the archive does that. You know, the archive does not privilege their voices. So what I found within my own work is that I have to find a lot of unique sorts of materials that maybe are not typical within these sorts of studies. And one place that I've actually found is, you know, Emma Anderson's children, right, paying attention to the way the violence focuses in different places, but also actually animals. The Sichango Lakota boys at the school I'm studying, the place that I'm able to get the greatest insight at all into their religion is through their relationship to horses, both imagined, like physically imagined, pretending one another are ponies, but also imagining within their head, carrying this within them to kind of connect to this warrior culture. And then also actual physical, like attempting to be close to horses. So that's kind of where I come in on this. We really need to expand both sort of the age ranges, the genders, the sexualities, whose like mindsets, whose perceptions count within this study, right? A lot of people would say, if you don't have a diary of a child talking about their religious experience, you can't know their religious experience. Therefore, you can't do a study of them. And then also looking towards these different materials. So for me, photographic culture and material culture, like embroidered pieces, for example, paintings, those are places that I'm able to get at. And those are sorts of things that, you know, society, church history, more broadly, like Christian history, is not always the best at actually counting and seeing as legitimate history. So, or legitimate historical primary sources. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point about expansions, or you're pointing us to expanding what counts as evidence, what counts as a subject worthy of studying, and then also the complications of the archive and how to get to it. So really appreciated that. For me, in terms of expansion, a lot of my connection to the Society of Church History and the journal, and then my own positionality between religious studies and American Indian Indigenous studies as a faculty member, uh, has been about expanding what counts. And that's because my own work sits in the borderlands, right? So I work on colonial Jesuit missionaries and their encounter with indigenous communities in northern New Spain. And New Spain encompasses parts of what are now Mexico and the US. In terms of my study, more broadly, it encompasses the Pacific Ocean, the Philippines, to the Caribbean, Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, right? So when we talk about New Spain, it was this transoceanic and continental endeavor of the Spanish Empire to establish itself in what they consider to be the New World by employing missionaries to extend Christendom into indigenous lands. And so just locationally, the sorts of sites that I'm working on sit in what are now parts of Mexico and the US. So my scholarship has always had to kind of bridge a historiography that's connected to Latin America, as well as US American Indian history. And so for me, that's meant within the society participating over the years in connections and conversations with the Conference for Latin American History, which we comment on in this piece, generated some of the articles that we included. So the piece by Karen Velez that I mentioned earlier, as well as the piece by Danny Wasserman Soler, are both really out of that collaboration. They're folks who largely participate in the Conference for Latin American History, but we did some panels in the mid-2000s to bring those conversations together. And I think it reflected a wider trend of not letting the nation state contain our stories, right? Because that's a colonial invention. Those borders are, in some ways, the very definitions of colonialism, right? And so to cross those borders is important, and it has been for a long time in Native American Indigenous studies. And again, needing more push in religious studies and histories of Christianity. So I think that hemispheric perspective thing, and not just about American Indian or US Native American stories, but connecting to wider indigenous histories of the Americas, of the Pacific world. And then, what we're trying to do by the end is really then push that further and say, let's think of a category of indigeneity that's not based on place per se, but based on encounter with settler colonial processes, or colonial processes, I should say. Not every situation is going to be settler colonial, but so that's, I think, a wider trend. And then one more note on that is that's really institutionally, both Zara and I are at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and you can kind of track these changes at our institution with a field that began in the 70s, led by Theda Perdue and Mike Green, to really prominent scholars of American Indian Studies who founded a program in AIS, American Indian Studies, at Carolina in the 70s. And then that grew. And around the time of my arrival at UNC became American Indian and Indigenous Studies, and much more explicitly engaged Latin American studies, folks working in our case, with Maya materials in Guatemala. And then right now, literally this semester, I'm a part of the Global Indigeneity Working Group, and we completed a cluster. Well, we're completing a cluster hire this year. We mostly completed one last year. We've got one more hire to do this year, and we're revamping a curriculum to take it from not just American Indian or American Indian and Indigenous Studies, but a program in Global Indigeneity and American Indian Studies that still centers the uniqueness of the U.S. story. And Zara can talk more about the constraints of that, but also is thinking more broadly. And just to say one more thing there, in terms of that cluster, we've hired a new scholar who is focused on Nahuatl religion in Eastern Mexico in our own department. But in other departments, Mosquito scholar from Nicaragua, an Ainu scholar from Japan. And so really it's just impressed itself upon us in our own institutional context that this is where we're going. We are seeing a sort of more attention to not comparison per se, but the way in which Indigenous communities across the globe have had to negotiate colonial settlement.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And I think that that's really what is striking about kind of what you're trying to do in this piece, but also clearly thinking about like in your own institution, is both this expansion of looking at indigeneity in a global perspective, but also to get to what Zara was speaking about, also diversity in Indigenous voices, right? Not assuming that just by including an Indigenous voice that that's the perspective of all Indigenous voices, right? Seems to be an important point. So on that, I don't want to hold up too much more of your time. So I guess I'll end with what I guess is a rather big question. But if you had to have readers of this virtual issue, either in terms of your introduction or also in terms of the articles themselves, walk away with kind of one thing about Indigenous studies and Christianity, what would that be?
Okay, I'm going to start this, Zara. I think we've talked about this a lot, so I think we've got some similar answers. But I'll start and then let you expand. And if you don't mind, Chris, I'm going to sneak in too. But the bigger thing is centering Native presence.
Yes.
And that means in the society, that means in the journal, that means in our own research, making connections, establishing a reciprocity and relationality with contemporary Indigenous communities. Even if you think you're a scholar of the 16th century, there are descendant communities and there are Native nations and tribes that you need to make yourself responsible to, right? And not just as an afterthought. Don't do the archival work and then bring it to someone and say, hey, give me your stamp of approval. No, really from the beginning, and even conceptualizing what projects might be, they should really be driven by the needs of the Indigenous communities you're working with. And so that's really a commitment that comes out of NACE that I think might seem foreign or difficult for a lot of historians, right? You risk being accused of the bugaboo of presentism, right? Or importation, anachronism. And I think that's going to be a challenge for everyone. And just to speak to one example of that challenge, about 6-7 years ago, we wanted to do a panel on this issue on Native Americans and Christianity at the American Society of Church History. And we approached several Indigenous scholars whose work connects to this, who expressed really no interest in participating. And I think that was a mixture of maybe just not knowing about those conversations, never having been invited. But I think in a lot of ways, a feeling like there's a much longer history, as we see in some ways evidenced in some of the earlier articles here, of ignoring Indigenous presence, right? And to the extent that it's like, well, if you don't want me, I'm not going to go, right? And so we've got a lot of work to do there, I think, to not just invite people to come into our space, but actually to intentionally go into conferences like Ethnohistory, like NASA, to connect to learn from the work that's going on there. Zara, do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that this also connects to the question of, can the fields talk to one another? Which the answer is, of course, yes. But I think on the part of scholars, there sometimes is this question of, are we doing the same things? Are we using the same sources? I think that NAIS recognizes that if you are going to do any kind of work around indigeneity, it is always going to involve the present. These conceptions of the past is in the past and the present is the present and the future is tomorrow just is not, it's not the same calculus. There's not the same timeline or understanding of temporality as you're going to get somewhere like studies of Christianity. And with that, there was a little bit of disagreement when Brandon and I were finishing up this introduction, and the question was, are the references to Killers of the Flower Moon and Reservation Dogs appropriate, or is that an attempt to maybe be too presentist, maybe bring out something that's sexy pop culturally, but doesn't actually belong in this sort of like official, space of true history. And of course, the conversation was had, and it turns out, yes, this does belong here. And we were all able to have a really productive conversation around that. But that's all that to say, like, we need to expand the sources, and we need to be willing to look at archives that move beyond what we traditionally imagine as archives. These sorts of really important spaces, however, that are, tend to be in elite spaces and tend to have state protections, and maybe only certain people are allowed to use them, right? And start looking towards sources that maybe are past, present, and future at the same time and have something to say.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think that that's a great point for us to end on. So I just want to thank both of you for taking the time today. And to those listening, if you have not taken a look at the virtual issue yet, please do so. All right, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much.